Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be talking about managing our dependencies. So how do we bring in the proper dependencies and projects into our existing projects so that things work the way that they are supposed to work? Let's talk about these. So when we're creating a Liferay application, we typically have dependencies on other modules, on other libraries, and so on. Some of these libraries may not be OSGI bundles, so we're going to need to be able to take into account how do we bring those in. Whether we're using Gradle or Maven, the principles and the ideas that we're about to talk about apply to both. Again, typically in the Liferay ecosystem, we are using Gradle, but again, feel free to use what you like. Some basic concepts as we go through the rest of this lecture, right? The class loading is managed by the OSGI container. Typically, when we're putting classes within webinf/classes, those are not exposed to the OSGI container, but things that are put in the global class loader typically are. When we're in the OSGI world, when we have an OSGI bundle, we have to explicitly declare our exports, right? So within that bnd.bnd, we must declare the export, even if we bring in the whole OSGI bundle. If we do not declare the export, then that dependency may not be available to our project. So how do we kind of navigate some of these waters? Well, first and foremost, an OSGI compliant jar, if we deploy it within the OSGI container, then that is made available to the rest of the OSGI container and the bundles within it, right? There are some common libraries that are out there that are OSGIified, if I can use that word. So common libraries that have been ported into the OSGI world so that the dependency management is made a little bit easier. Now, when we're talking about the Liferay world, if we're using Gradle, there is a Gradle plugin that takes care of some of the hardest parts when we're looking for dependencies. By using this property within Gradle.properties, we can specify which platform of Liferay are we using, or more specifically, which version. So if we're using Liferay 7.1, we can have that as the target platform. All the dependencies will be updated according to that version that we're developing for. Same story applies with this case here in 7.2. This typically works for most of the dependencies that we work with in the Liferay world. What's an example? Again, typically in your build.gradle files, you will have to append the version at the very end of a specific dependency. Since in the previous slide, we're using that target platform is going to take care of the versions for us. So it takes care of a lot of the hard part of trying to sort through which version of a specific dependency do we need. Now, when we're talking about dependency management, we have a pretty extensive list of the common dependency management tasks that you're going to be going through. Now, we're not going to go through every single one in detail, but let's highlight some of the very important ones. So the first one is referencing another module project. So maybe you've already created a Liferay module project and you have some dependencies or functionality within it that you want to bring into another one. You can do that very simply within your build.gradle. What you'll need to do is have the compile only followed by project. Following the syntax that you see here, you'll then provide the path to that specific module project. In this case, within the modules folder, inside the training module project, we'll have a Liferay module called training module-API that we are bringing into our current project, whatever that might be. Now, another task would be trying to bring in a specific component or a specific class that exists within the Liferay ecosphere. Unless you've been developing for Liferay for a very, very long time or you've memorized the source code, it might be a little bit difficult to know where exactly does a specific class reside within all of these different jar files. So one resource we have is Liferay's Nexus repository. You can head over to that link that you see here, and then from there, search for that specific class. Maybe it's the journal article, maybe it's something else. Once you search for it, right, it'll give you a list of results and where that class resides. From there, once you select it, you'll then have the option and the opportunity to then pick whether you want to add this to a pom.xml or a build.gradle. So let's take a look at an example. So in this example, we're going to find the Gradle dependency for the BlogsEntry class. We start off by heading over to that Nexus repository. We know the class that we want. It's going to be the BlogsEntry. From there, we type it in the search. We are given a number of different results. From there, we'll select a specific one and add it to our, in this situation, build.gradle. Since we're using that target platform that we talked about, we don't need to specify the specific version. If we were not using that target platform, typically best practice is to pick the lowest version that works. That way we ensure some sort of backwards compatibility. Since we're using the target platform, we don't need to worry about it. Gradle dependency scopes. When we're using Gradle, right, Gradle itself has a number of different scopes. How do we want to bring in the dependency? Again, typically we're going to be using the compile only. Classes are only included at compile time, non-transitive, right? Again, during build time, those dependencies may already be made available, so we don't need to worry about it. But in order for our code to compile, we're going to need those dependencies during compile time. So that's typically the tag that we use the most, but just keep in mind of these other ones, right? They may be useful at specific times. Versions. So again, we mentioned that if we're using the target platform, don't need to worry about versioning. But let's go through the situation where we might need to worry about it a little bit. Now, when we're looking at the versioning, for example, when we're bringing in specific packages from different OSGI bundles or Liferay modules, right, we may need to specify the version. So here within the versioning, we can define what range we might need. So one example here is we're trying to import a package in which the version includes 1.3 but goes all the way up to but excludes version 2. So that way here in the build.gradle, right, we would bring in that version 1.3.0 to appease the one that's within the bnd.bnd. Now bringing in another situation here within the bnd.bnd, right, we're specifying between versions 1.3.0 all the way to version 2, whereas in the build.gradle, we might be specifying a different version, 1.3.2. What's going to end up happening is we're going to have to depend on the build.gradle's version in this case. Since the build.gradle requires 1.3.2, if we're bringing in something that's outdated, we might run into some issues, specifically that unresolved requirement issue that comes up when we're unable to import the proper modules. Okay, a very common question that comes up is how do we bring in some of the third-party dependencies that might not be an OSGI bundle? So the first thing that we need to do, assuming that we're using Gradle, is that we're going to get all of the dependencies that we need, and we're going to be adding them to a module's lib folder. And then from there, we'll need to make sure that we define within our build.gradle the dependencies that we're looking to bring in. Those are the big two things, at least at the very high level. So build.gradle, this is a specific dependency that we need. Within our bnd.bnd file, we have two different options in regards to how do we want to bring it in. We can either include the resource tag like so, specify the jar file, or we can include the resource like this in option number 2, specifying where exactly is that jar file. Okay, now we talked earlier about the global class loader and how typically, right, the OSGI container can pick up from the global class loader. So within our properties, we can define specifically within our portal properties which libraries are made available from the global class loader. So let's go ahead and sum up some of the things that we talked about within this video. First and foremost, the build.gradle file is what's going to help us provide the dependencies. That's where we're going to define all of them. The bnd.bnd is what helps wire the dependencies to our bundles, saying that this bundle is being exported and what version of it. Right. Generally speaking, we typically try to use that compile only Gradle scope for dependencies that are not provided. If we are going to be specifying version numbers, we're always going to try to use the lowest compatible versions when we're talking about dependencies. Between the build.gradle and the bnd.bnd file, the information is merged. So if there is a conflict, or if one requires a higher version than the other, then that's going to be the bare minimum. So if build.gradle provides a higher minor number than is accepted in bnd.bnd, the version from build.gradle becomes the minimum in effect. We like to run that Gradle refresh as much as possible. Sometimes Gradle doesn't automatically refresh, therefore not bringing in the proper dependencies. So we oftentimes like to Gradle refresh manually. And finally, if there are any problems with our dependencies, typically clearing the Gradle cache does resolve that. So very good. This wraps it up for this video, and I will see you in the next video.